The morning of October 14th, 1944, over the industrial city of Schweinfurt in central Germany, Major Heinz brought his Faller Wolf 190 around for another pass at the American bomber formation. He had already downed 2 B-17s that morning. His ammunition counters showed he had rounds remaining for perhaps one more engagement before he would need to break off and return to base. Bär was 24 years old. He had been flying combat missions since 1939. Over 5 years of nearly continuous combat, he had 204 confirmed aerial victories. He was exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. It was a weariness that had settled into his bones, into his thinking, into the way he pulled the aircraft through its maneuvers. As he approached the bomber stream, he noticed something that had become increasingly common in recent months. The American fighter escorts P-51 Mustangs were everywhere, not just covering the bombers, but aggressively hunting German fighters. And they were good, not exceptional perhaps, not the kind of superlative skill that came from years of combat, but competent, disturbingly, consistently competent. One of the Mustangs broke toward him. Bär evaluated the approach, the angle, the speed. The American pilot made no obvious errors. His positioning was correct. His energy management was sound. Bär forced his aircraft into a defensive spiral, using every trick he had learned over 5 years of combat. The Americans stayed with him for several seconds before breaking off, likely low on fuel or ammunition. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Bär returned to base. In the dispersal area, he found 3 of his squadron's aircraft had not returned. 2 experienced pilots were dead. One was a 20-year-old who had arrived at the squadron 6 weeks earlier with barely adequate training. The young pilot had lasted exactly 4 missions. That evening in the officers' mess, Bär sat with Oberstleutnant Johann Steinhoff, another highly experienced pilot with 176 confirmed victories. They discussed what they were seeing in the air. The Americans seemed to have an endless supply of pilots. Not brilliant pilots, but adequate ones. Pilots who knew their aircraft, who understood basic fighter tactics, who didn't make the catastrophic errors that allowed easy victories. Steinhoff mentioned something he had heard from a captured American pilot during an interrogation. The Americans rotated their pilots home after completing a set number of combat missions, 25 missions for bomber crews in some periods, 50 missions for fighter pilots in others. Then they went home back to the United States. Away from combat, Bär found this concept almost incomprehensible. Why would you remove an experienced effort pilot from combat? A pilot who had survived long enough to learn his trade, to become genuinely effective, to accumulate the kind of combat wisdom that kept you alive. It seemed wasteful, irrational, the kind of decision that reflected American abundance rather than sound military thinking. He had no way of knowing that this seemingly wasteful decision, this rotation policy that appeared to throw away hard-won experience, was creating a systemic advantage that would prove insurmountable, that every American pilot sent home became a teacher, that each teacher would train dozens of new pilots, that the mathematics of this system would produce results that individual heroism, no matter how exceptional, could never match. The question that would haunt German fighter pilots for the remainder of the war was simple. Where do all these Americans come from? Why don't they run out of pilots? The answer was being built not in the skies over Europe, but in training facilities across the United States. And it was an answer that represented a fundamental difference in how 2 nations approached the problem of aerial warfare. Part 2, the German system, logic and success. The Luftwaffe's approach to fighter pilot development was not arbitrary. It was built on sound military logic that had proven effective in the early years of the war. German military theorists had studied aerial combat from the First World War and had drawn specific conclusions about what created effective fighter pilots. Experience was everything. A pilot who survived his first 5 combat missions had a reasonable chance of surviving 50. A pilot who survived 50 missions might survive 500. The learning curve was steep, brutal, and written in blood. But once a pilot climbed that curve, once he internalized the countless small decisions that meant the difference between life and death, he became exponentially more effective. The Luftwaffe identified these survivors and built its fighter force around them. They called them expert in experts. These were pilots who had accumulated not just victories, but the deep understanding of aerial combat that came from prolonged exposure to mortal danger. They understood energy management instinctively. They could evaluate a tactical situation in seconds. They knew their aircraft's capabilities at the edge of the performance envelope because they had been to that edge repeatedly and survived. Major Erich Hartmann exemplified this system. He joined Gagashwadata 52 on the Eastern Front in October of 1942. His first combat missions were disasters. He was shot down by Soviet aircraft. He was nearly killed by Soviet ground fire. He made errors that would have been fatal, if not for the intervention of more experienced pilots in his unit. But he survived, and he learned by 1943. He was accumulating victories at a rate that seemed impossible. His final tally would reach 352 confirmed aerial victories, a number that remains unmatched by any pilot from any nation in any war. He achieved this by flying continuously, by remaining in combat, by never rotating away from the front. Major Gerhard Barkhorn, also of Jagdashwadata 52, accumulated 301 confirmed victories. Major Gerl achieved 275. Oberleutnant Atak Kit reached 267 victories before being killed in action in February of 1945. These were not anomalies. The Luftwaffe had more than 100 pilots with over 100 confirmed victories each. The system that produced these results was built on continuous combat exposure. German fighter pilots flew until they were killed, severely wounded, or captured. There was no rotation policy, no fixed number of missions after which you could expect to go home. You flew until you couldn't fly anymore. This created a force with concentrated expertise. The top pilots were extraordinarily capable. They could accomplish missions that seemed impossible. Hartmann developed a tactical approach that minimized his risk while maximizing his effectiveness. He would position himself unseen, close to within optimal firing range, take a single high percentage shot, and immediately break away. This method kept him alive through over 400 combat missions. Part 3. Building the World Context and Ideology. The Luftwaffe system reflected broader German military culture and the specific constraints Germany faced as a continental power surrounded by potential enemies. The Wehrmacht had always emphasized quality over quantity. German military theorists believed that superior training, better equipment, and tactical excellence could overcome numerical disadvantages. This philosophy had deep roots in Prussian and German military tradition. During the wars of German unification in the 1860s and 1870s, Prussian forces had defeated larger Austrian and French armies through superior training, staff work, and operational art. The concept of the highly trained professional soldier who could accomplish what conscript masses could not was embedded in German military thinking. In the 1930s, as Germany rebuilt its military in violation of the Versailles Treaty, the Luftwaffe adopted this philosophy for its fighter force. They would create an elite corps of fighter pilots, men who would undergo extensive training and then remain in combat until they achieved mastery of their craft. These experts would form the core of the fighter force, providing leadership and achieving the kind of exceptional results that would multiply their impact. The early years of the Second World War seemed to validate this approach completely. During the Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 1939, German pilots of the Condor Legion gained combat experience while supporting nationalist forces. These veterans returned to Germany with practical knowledge of aerial combat that proved invaluable when war began in Europe. In September of 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, Luftwaffe fighter pilots encountered Polish aircraft that were generally inferior in performance. Polish pilots fought bravely, but they were overwhelmed by better aircraft and more experienced German pilots. The campaign lasted 5 weeks. The Luftwaffe established air superiority quickly and maintained it throughout. In May of 1940, the invasion of France and the Low Countries again demonstrated Luftwaffe effectiveness. French and British air forces had numerous aircraft and brave pilots, but they were defeated by superior German tactics and by the combat experience German pilots had accumulated. The Luftwaffe's fighter force dominated the skies over the battlefield, enabling the rapid German advance that led to France's surrender in 6 weeks. These victories reinforced German confidence in their system. The Experten were proving their worth. Pilots like Vera Mulders and Adolf Galland became national heroes, their victory tallies growing with each campaign. The logic seemed unassailable. Keep your best pilots in combat, let them accumulate experience and victories, and they would provide the fighter superiority Germany needed. Even the Battle of Britain, fought from July to October of 1940, did not fundamentally challenge this belief despite being a German defeat. The Luftwaffe lost the battle primarily due to strategic and operational errors, not because their pilot development system was flawed. German fighter pilots continued to achieve impressive individual victory tallies even while losing the campaign. While German pilots flew until death or capture, the United States Army Air Forces implemented a fundamentally different system. This was not immediately obvious to German commanders, and when they first learned of it, many dismissed it as another example of American inefficiency and waste. The American rotation policy evolved throughout the war, but its core principle remained constant. Combat pilots would fly a specified number of missions, then rotate back to the United States for rest and reassignment, often as instructors. For bomber crews in the 8th Air Force operating over Europe, the initial requirement was 25 missions. This was later increased to 30, then 35 missions as the war progressed, and as improved tactics and equipment increased survival rates. For fighter pilots, the requirements varied by theater and time period. In Europe, fighter pilots initially flew 200 to 300 combat hours before rotation. Later in the war, this shifted to specific mission counts, often around 50 combat missions. In the Pacific theater, tour lengths were sometimes calculated in months rather than missions, typically 6 to 12 months of combat duty. The logic behind this policy was not immediately apparent even to many American commanders. General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, faced criticism from some quarters that the rotation policy was removing experienced pilots from combat just when they were becoming most effective. Why send home a pilot who had survived long enough to master his craft? The answer lay in a broader understanding of industrial warfare and organizational learning. The American military, particularly the Army Air Forces, recognized that individual expertise, no matter how exceptional, could not overcome systemic advantages in pilot production and training quality. Lieutenant Colonel Philip Cochrane, a fighter pilot who completed a combat tour in North Africa before returning to the United States as an instructor, explained the system's logic in a 1944 interview. A pilot who had survived 50 combat missions possessed knowledge that was extremely valuable, but that knowledge was only valuable if it could be transmitted to other pilots. One experienced pilot flying combat could achieve perhaps 2 or 3 victories per mission if he was exceptional. That same pilot serving as an instructor for 6 months could train 50 new pilots, each of whom would be significantly more capable than they would have been without his instruction. The mathematics were compelling. 50 pilots, each even marginally more capable due to better instruction, represented far more combat power than one exceptional pilot, no matter how skilled. And if each of those 50 pilots survived to complete their own tours and become instructors, the multiplication effect became exponential. The United States had the industrial capacity and geographic security to implement this system. American training facilities were located in the continental United States, thousands of miles from any combat zone. Student pilots trained without the threat of enemy attack. Fuel was abundant. Aircraft were plentiful. If a student damaged an aircraft during training, another was available. The primary training facilities included Naval Air Station, Pensacola in Florida, which had been training naval aviators since 1914. Randolph Field in Texas, called the West Point of the Air, opened in 1930 and became the primary training facility for Army aero pilots. Corpus Christi Naval Air Station in Texas, which began operations in 1941, could train thousands of pilots simultaneously. Luke Field in Arizona, Thunderbird Field, also in Arizona, and dozens of other facilities across the American South and Southwest, produced pilots in numbers that would have seemed impossible to European observers. By 1943, the American pilot training program was producing over 100 zero pilots per year across all services. This included not just fighter pilots, but bomber pilots, transport pilots, and all other aviation specialties. The scale was unprecedented in military history. Each training facility followed standardized curricula developed by experienced combat pilots who had rotated home. Students received approximately 200 hours of flight training before earning their wings. This included basic flight training, instrument training, formation flying, gunnery training, and tactical instruction. After earning their wings, fighter pilots received additional specialized training in the specific aircraft they would fly in combat. The American system created a virtuous cycle that German commanders failed to fully appreciate until it was too late. Each combat veteran who rotated home brought current tactical knowledge back to the training pipeline. This knowledge was systematically incorporated into training curricula, ensuring that new pilots learned from the experiences of those who had survived combat. Captain Donald Belay, who flew Spitfires with the Royal Air Force before transferring to the United States Army Air Forces, completed multiple combat tours. Between tours, he served as an instructor and helped develop tactical doctrine for the P-47 Thunderbolt. The lessons he taught, derived from his combat experience, were learned by hundreds of student pilots. Those pilots carried that knowledge into combat, where it kept them alive long enough to gain their own experience. This process created what modern analysts would call institutional learning. The American military was learning as an organization, not just as a collection of individuals. Each combat veteran who returned home represented a data point. Their experiences, their successful tactics, their mistakes, all became part of a growing body of knowledge that was systematically taught to new pilots. The contrast with the German system became more stark as the war progressed. German Experten accumulated personal expertise that died with them when a pilot with 200 victories was shot down and killed. All of his knowledge, all of his hard-won tactical wisdom was lost. The Luftwaffe had no systematic method of capturing and transmitting this knowledge to new pilots. By 1944, German fighter pilot training had been severely curtailed due to fuel shortages and the need to commit available aircraft to combat rather than training. New German pilots arrived at operational units with as little as 160 hours of total flight time, including their basic training. They had minimal gunnery training, limited formation flying experience, and virtually no tactical instruction. They were sent into combat against Allied pilots who had received twice as much training and who had been taught by combat veterans. The results were predictable and tragic. New German pilots were shot down at appalling rates. On the Eastern Front, a new pilot's life expectancy was measured in missions, not months. In the West, facing American and British pilots with superior training and numerical superiority, survival rates were even lower. German aces often found themselves flying with wingmen who were dangerous liabilities rather than assets, pilots who required protection rather than providing it. Major Heinz Bär, returning from a mission in November of 1944, found that his assigned wingman, a 19-year-old with less than 200 total flight hours, had become separated from the formation and had not returned. The young pilot's aircraft was found crashed 30 mi from the combat zone. Investigators determined he had simply become disoriented and had run out of fuel trying to find his way back to base. He had been killed by his own inexperience, not by enemy action. This pattern repeated thousands of times. The Luftwaffe was bleeding experienced pilots who could not be replaced. Each loss represented not just a casualty, but the elimination of years of accumulated knowledge. Meanwhile, the Americans were creating more experienced pilots faster than they were losing. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The American advantage was not just numerical, though numbers mattered enormously. It was qualitative. By late 1944, the average American fighter pilot arriving in Europe had better training than the average German fighter pilot he would face. The American pilot had been trained by combat veterans. He had received extensive gunnery training. He had practiced formation flying for hundreds of hours. He understood his aircraft thoroughly because he had flown it extensively in training. The German pilot, by contrast, had received minimal training due to resource constraints. He had little gunnery training because ammunition was scarce. He had limited flight time because fuel was rationed. He arrived at his operational unit as a liability, someone who needed to be protected and taught by the few remaining experienced pilots who were themselves exhausted from continuous combat. The numbers told a story that individual heroism could not overcome. In 1943, the United States graduated over 65,000 pilots from its various training programs. Germany graduated approximately 15,000 pilots that same year. By 1944, as German resources became more constrained and American production increased, the disparity grew wider. American training facilities operated at scales that were difficult for European observers to comprehend. At Naval Air Station Corpus Christi alone, more than 35,000 pilots received training between 1941 and 1945. The facility covered over 2,000 acres and included multiple auxiliary airfields. At peak operation, it had over 700 aircraft assigned for training purposes. Thunderbird Field in Arizona operated as a civilian contract school under military supervision, graduated more than 10,000 pilots during the war. Luke Field, also in Arizona, trained more than 12,000 pilots. These were just individual facilities. The United States operated dozens of such training bases, each producing hundreds or thousands of pilots per year. The industrial support for this training program was equally impressive. The United States produced over 300 aircraft during the Second World War. A significant portion of these were training aircraft. The Vultee BT-13 Valiant, a basic trainer, saw more than 11,000 examples produced. The North American At-6 Texan Advanced Trainer had more than 15,000 examples built for American and Allied use. These aircraft existed solely to train pilots. representing an investment in human capital that Germany could not match. German training suffered from the opposite problem. As the war progressed and Germany's situation deteriorated, fuel allocations for training were cut repeatedly. By 1944, German training units received barely enough fuel to provide students with minimal flying hours. Advanced training, the kind that taught tactical skills and combat techniques, was largely eliminated. New pilots were expected to learn these skills at operational units if they survived long enough. The survival statistics reflected this disparity. In 1944, a new American fighter pilot arriving in Europe for his first combat tour had approximately a 70% chance of surviving to complete that tour and return home. A new German fighter pilot arriving at an operational unit that same year had less than a 30% chance of surviving 3 months. These were not differences in courage or determination. German pilots fought with extraordinary bravery against overwhelming odds. They were differences in systems, in industrial capacity, in the fundamental approach to developing combat pilots. The American system created more pilots, better trained pilots, and preserved the knowledge gained through combat by rotating experienced pilots home to teach others. Major Erich Hartmann, still flying combat in early 1945 with 352 confirmed victories, was leading a formation that included 2 new pilots with less than 50 hours in the Messed Bf 109. He had to devote most of his attention to keeping these inexperienced pilots alive, limiting his own effectiveness. After one mission, he wrote in his diary that he felt less like a fighter pilot and more like a flight instructor conducting training under combat conditions. The irony, which he may not have fully appreciated, was that American flight instructors were doing exactly that, conducting training, but they were doing it safely in the United States with adequate fuel, aircraft, and time to properly prepare their students for combat. By January of 1945, the mathematical consequences of these different systems had become impossible to ignore. The Luftwaffe's fighter force was collapsing not primarily from lack of aircraft, though that was becoming a problem, but from lack of qualified pilots to fly them. German factories were still producing fighter aircraft. In some months, production actually increased despite Allied bombing, but there were not enough trained pilots to fly these aircraft effectively. Operation Bodenplatte, launched on January 1, 1945, demonstrated this crisis with brutal clarity. The operation was a massive strike against Allied airfields in Belgium, Holland, and France, involving over 900 Luftwaffe aircraft. It was one of the largest single-day commitments of German air power in the entire war. The goal was to destroy Allied aircraft on the ground, particularly the tactical fighters that were supporting Allied ground forces. The attack achieved some success. Nearly 300 Allied aircraft were destroyed or damaged on the ground. Several airfields were temporarily put out of action, but the cost to the Luftwaffe was catastrophic. More than 270 German aircraft were lost. Critically, more than 23 German pilots were killed or captured. These were not just any pilots. Many were experienced formation leaders, men with hundreds of missions and dozens of victories, men whose loss could not be replaced. Major Heinz Bär survived Bodenplatte, but he lost 4 pilots from his unit. 2 were killed. 2 were captured after being shot down over Allied-held territory. One of the dead pilots had 96 confirmed victories. His knowledge, his tactical expertise, his years of combat experience, all died with him. The Luftwaffe had no system to preserve what he had learned, no way to pass his hard-won wisdom to the next generation of pilots. The Americans, by contrast, could absorb losses that would have been crippling to Germany. When an experienced American pilot was shot down and killed, his knowledge was not lost because he had already transmitted it. Before deploying to combat, he had been trained by instructors who were combat veterans. When he completed his tour and rotated home, he would have become an instructor himself, teaching new pilots the lessons he had learned. Even his death represented the loss of one experienced pilot, not the loss of all the knowledge he possessed. After Boden-Platt, the Luftwaffe never recovered. Fuel shortages became more severe as Allied advances cut off oil supplies from Romania, and as synthetic fuel plants were destroyed by bombing. The few remaining experienced pilots flew fewer missions because fuel was not available. New pilots arrived with training that was barely adequate for them to take off and land safely, much less engage in combat. In February of 1945, Aus-Johann Steinhoff, commander of Jagdgeschwader 7, equipped with the new Messid Mi-2 162 jet fighter, wrote in his diary about the situation. He had won 176 confirmed victories. He was an experienced combat leader, but he was leading a unit where most of his pilots had never flown a jet aircraft before assignment to his unit. They were learning to fly revolutionary new technology, while simultaneously trying to learn combat tactics against an enemy that had overwhelming numerical superiority. The Mi-2 162 was a remarkable aircraft, the world's first operational jet fighter capable of speeds exceeding 540 mph. It was faster than any Allied fighter. Its 430 mm cannons could destroy a bomber with a single burst. But it was also difficult to fly, required long runways, and was maintenance intensive. Giving such an aircraft to pilots with minimal training was asking for disaster. On March 18, 1945, Steinhoff himself was severely burned when his Mi-2 162 crashed on takeoff. The accident was caused by a tire failure, but Steinhoff later reflected that fatigue from months of continuous operations had slowed his reactions. An experienced pilot in top condition might have saved the aircraft. He survived, but his combat career was over. Another highly experienced pilot removed from combat, his knowledge no longer available to the Luftwaffe. While Germany's pilot force collapsed, the American system continued to produce dividends that extended far beyond the immediate combat situation. The pilots who rotated home after completing their tours did not simply become instructors and then fade into history. Many of them became the foundation of American military aviation for decades after the war ended. Colonel Francis Gabreski completed his first combat tour in Europe with 28 confirmed aerial victories, making him one of the top American aces. He rotated home, served as an instructor, then returned for a second combat tour. After the war, he remained in the newly independent United States Air Force. During the Korean War, he flew F-86 Sabres and achieved 6.5 more victories, making him one of only 7 American pilots to achieve SE status in 2 wars. He retired as a colonel in 1967, having served as a senior officer and passing on his knowledge through multiple generations of pilots. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Johnson completed a combat tour in Europe with 27 confirmed victories. He rotated home, served briefly as a test pilot and instructor, then left active duty after the war. But his knowledge continued to influence American aviation. He wrote extensively about air combat tactics, consulted for the Air Force, and helped train new generations of fighter pilots through his writings and lectures. His book Thunderbolt, published in 1958, became required reading at Air Force training facilities. Major Thomas Maguire, who achieved 38 confirmed victories in the Pacific Theater, was killed in action in January of 1945 during what would have been his final combat tour before rotation. But before his death, he had already contributed to the training program. During a brief period in the United States between combat deployments, he spent 2 months at a training facility in California, sharing his tactical knowledge with student pilots. Those students carried his lessons into combat. Some of them survived the war and became instructors themselves, passing on what Maguire had taught them. This multiplication effect, this geometric expansion of knowledge, was precisely what the American system was designed to achieve. Each combat veteran who rotated home created dozens of more capable pilots. Each of those pilots, if they survived to complete their own tours, could become instructors and create dozens more. The system was exponential in its impact. The institutional knowledge that accumulated in American training facilities represented a strategic asset whose value was difficult to quantify but impossible to overstate. By 1945, American training curricula incorporated lessons from hundreds of thousands of combat missions. Student pilots learned from the collective experience of every American pilot who had completed a tour and returned home. They learned what worked and what didn't. They learned which tactics kept you alive and which got you killed. They learned from mistakes that other pilots had made and survived to report. German pilots, by contrast, learned primarily from their own mistakes, if they survived them. New German pilots arrived at operational units with minimal training and no exposure to combat veterans' knowledge, because those veterans were still flying combat, exhausted, and increasingly desperate until they were killed or the war ended. The statistical impact was measurable. In the final months of the war, American fighter pilots in Europe were achieving kill ratios exceeding 5:1 against German aircraft. This was not because American pilots were naturally superior or because American aircraft were overwhelmingly better, though American numerical superiority certainly helped. It was because American pilots were better trained, had been taught by combat veterans, understood their aircraft thoroughly, and had learned tactics that maximized their advantages and minimized their vulnerabilities. When the war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, the Luftwaffe ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Major Erich Hartmann surrendered to American forces, who then turned him over to the Soviets. He spent 10 years in Soviet captivity, not returning to Germany until 1955. Major Gerhard Barkhorn survived the war and later joined the post-war West German Luftwaffe, serving until 1975. Major Heinz survived 404 combat missions and 220 confirmed victories, making him one of the few top German aces to survive the entire war. These men were extraordinarily skilled pilots who had achieved results that seemed impossible, but their individual excellence could not overcome the systemic advantages their opponents possessed. After the war, several German aces acknowledged this reality in interviews and memoirs. Bär later stated that by 1944 he knew Germany had lost the air war not because German pilots lacked courage or skill, but because the mathematics were insurmountable. The American rotation policy, which had seemed wasteful and inefficient to German observers, had created a force that was both quantitatively and qualitatively superior. The United States ended the war with thousands of trained pilots, extensive training facilities, and an institutional knowledge base that would support American military aviation for decades. The Luftwaffe ended the war with a handful of surviving aces, destroyed training facilities, and no systematic way to preserve or transmit the knowledge that had been gained through 6 years of combat. Post-war analysis by American and British military historians confirmed what had become apparent during the war's final year. The rotation policy was not a humanitarian gesture or a morale-building exercise, though it served both those purposes. It was a force multiplier of enormous strategic significance. By systematically rotating experienced pilots home to become instructors, the United States created a training pipeline that produced pilots faster than they could be lost in combat and ensured that each new pilot was better trained than his predecessor. The German Experten system, by contrast, concentrated expertise in individuals whose knowledge died with them. It created impressive individual records but failed to build institutional capacity. When those experts were inevitably lost to combat attrition, their knowledge was lost with them, and the system had no way to replace either the pilots or their expertise. The TUMAT lessons learned extended beyond World War II. The United States applied similar rotation policies during the Korean War, and with some modifications during the Vietnam War. The principle remained constant: individual expertise is valuable, but institutional knowledge is strategic. A military force that systematically captures and transmits combat experience through its training pipeline creates advantages that individual heroism, no matter how exceptional, cannot overcome. For the German aces who survived the war, there was a bitter recognition of what might have been. If Germany had possessed the industrial capacity and strategic depth to implement a rotation policy similar to America's, if German training facilities could have operated safely thousands of miles from combat zones, if fuel and aircraft had been available for extensive training, the air war might have progressed differently. But Germany never possessed these advantages, and the Experten system, for all its creation of individual excellence, could not compensate for fundamental strategic disadvantages. The story that began with Major Heinz Bär's confusion over American rotation policy ended with a broader truth about industrial warfare. Individual skill matters, training matters, equipment matters, but systems matter more. The side that builds better systems for developing, preserving, and transmitting expertise creates advantages that accumulate over time until they become overwhelming. The American rotation policy was such a system, and its success demonstrated a principle that remains valid. In modern warfare, the nation that treats human capital as systematically as it treats material resources gains advantages that individual heroism cannot overcome. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now. And don't forget to subscribe.